I just want to make sure when I'm giving feedback that I'm coming from that direction where I do sincerely care about the person, but I'm also being direct in what I need to see from them. Hey there, welcome to Book Overflows, the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How's it going, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, thanks for sticking around, listening, everyone. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe if you're on YouTube. You can leave a 5-star review on any audio platforms. And we mean that. If you're a regular listener and you haven't left a review yet, take a moment now, pause the podcast, and leave a 5-star review. And thanks for following us on YouTube as well. We just hit 9,000 subscribers on YouTube. I haven't checked the audio numbers in a while, but it's around that across all the other audio platforms too. So that's exciting for us. I mean, Nathan, you texted me about that yesterday, so obviously you're excited. How you feeling about 9,000?
Yeah, we've had some steady growth. I think month to month, there's no exponential growth, but we're getting steady growth. And I love the increased engagement in the comments. Those mean a lot to us, both positive and negative. We want radical candor as well from our listeners. So,
well,
yeah.
The nice thing with the podcast is that we're learning a ton from it, and we have a ton of fun recording the episodes. So I think we'd still be doing this if we had 2 listeners, just because we're getting a lot out of it. But it makes it a lot more meaningful that there's a lot of listeners, and we are grateful and hope that you guys feel like you're learning too. That's what the whole point of this podcast. And yeah, you can always book time with us on Leland if you want to learn more, if you want to have more in-depth conversations with us individually. And if you talk with us on Leland, you will be subject to our Radical Candor, because we have just finished Radical Candor by Kim Scott. Covered the first half last week. We did the second half this week. It's divided into 2 parts, and it has an afterword, which is actually quite long. And so, I'm like, hey, I finished the book. I'm like, there's 2.5 hours left because I did this on audio. Well, let's talk about it. Just a reminder. So Kim Scott, she is a former executive at Google and Apple who developed the Radical Candor framework while teaching a management class at Apple University. After leading teams at some of tech's most successful companies, she co-founded Radical Candor LLC to help organizations worldwide implement compassionate, direct communication. Her work has transformed management practices globally, making her one of the most influential voices in modern leadership. And a reminder, the book introduction is Radical Candor offers a simple but powerful management philosophy. You can care personally and challenge directly, avoiding the traps of being either a pushover or a jerk. Kim Scott, drawing from her leadership experience at Google and Apple, shows how to build relationships where both praise and criticism help people grow. The framework has become required reading for successful organizations, teaching leaders to create cultures of compassionate candor, build cohesive teams, and achieve results collaboratively. So, we wrapped up this book this week. We've now officially read all of Radical Candor. Give me your thoughts, Nathan. What are your thoughts on Radical Candor, maybe particularly the second half of the book?
Yeah. So, the second half is sort of the playbook. The first one was the philosophy of how all this stuff should work. The second half is really a lot of tactical pieces. And I think my conclusion is this is an important book. I think it has had a huge influence in the industry. And I think that some of the ways that people have interacted with me are probably, like, from managers' standpoint, are probably like half understandings of Radical Candor. It's like they almost get the concepts, and I'm like, that didn't land properly. And I think Kim Scott even brings this up in the foreword of the book of like why the joke happens in Silicon Valley TV show, why these other things people have used and abused aspects of it. But I will say some of the tactics are really good, and I think I will probably refer back to parts of part 2 when I need to understand or maybe structure what the expectations are in a good one-to-one, or some of these other pieces that kind of come up. I will say though, the tone of the book, I can't shake that it has a very like McKinsey consultant approach that I don't love. I've worked with lots of McKinsey, and I'm not making this a dig as to McKinsey consultants. I would say the worst part about a McKinsey consultant is how obnoxiously achievement-oriented and successful they are. I will see this and I'll be like, wow, that's an amazing way to operate. But I'm not that person. Like, I'm not Ivy League, this world. And so I think that this book is a really good playbook for those to be like, hey, you're going to be interacting with a lot of normal people that are not us. And here's how you need to like make sure to think about regular people. Because again, like Harvard and Stanford didn't care about me. That was never like on my trajectory of like, you know what, if I just push a little bit harder, I'll get into Stanford. Like, nah. But that being said, like, I think that she's talking to herself in the past, right? Like, I think if I put my radical empathy, hopefully not ruinous empathy, but if I put empathy in here, I'm like, Kim Scott's giving like a playbook to herself earlier in her career. And I think that there are Kim Scotts that are coming through the system all the time that need this book. And I would inevitably, you're going to interact with somebody who has that background. And I think that this is a really good book for them to be the best manager for people who might be like, I would say that I'm much more likely to be in the rock star category. I've had places where I've done superstar kind of breakthroughs, but I'm much more of a rock star kind of person. Like I like to do deep technical dives. I want to be domain expert. I want to do these things. And so again, what reasons I love the books in the way that we read them is that like it helps me understand when I go, this person isn't making any sense to me. Oh, actually, I think they might be using aspects of this framework of radical candor. And this helps me understand how to interact with them better too, I guess. So anyway, that's my long-winded intro. So
No, that all makes sense to me. Yeah, it's because this book has the reputation of kind of being like the Silicon Valley management book. And I realized about maybe halfway through the second section that I was being way too unfair to this book. I had like my Thanos moment when he says to, what's his daughter, Nebula, when he's like, perhaps I treated you too harshly. That's how I felt to Radical Candor, because I've only worked at big companies in my career, up until now, I guess. But I spent about 3 years between two kind of classic Silicon Valley big tech companies. And listeners, I kid you not when I say that I did not have a single good manager at either of those companies. And with one caveat, and I'll get that in a second. You might say, well, that's not surprising, only 3 years. Well, here's the thing. I had 7 managers across those 3 years at those two companies. Yeah, insane. Yeah. And that's why you can kind of say like, well, okay, 7 managers and none of them were good. Maybe there's a common denominator here. It's like that's possible. I also think it's really weird to have 7 managers in 3 years. And yeah, not a single one was good at their job, with the exception of one who I still am we're in contact today. But he was in the awkward position of just filling in between one manager leaving and trying to find another one. And he was also the director of our organization. And so I think he could have been really good if he had been just my manager. But he was just torn between a lot of places. I don't blame him at all for it. But I'll say out of the 7, he is the only one who explicitly told me, I practice radical candor. Like this was his philosophy. And so there's a part of me when I was reading this book and like, I was like, applying it to all my managers and kind of like assuming that they had all read and lived by this book. And I was like, oh yeah, well, you guys think you're so great. You're the Silicon Valley managers. Well, you all sucked. And then I was like mad at this book because I was like, while my Silicon Valley managers stunk and you're the Silicon Valley textbook. And then as I kind of thought about it more, I'm like, no, the thing is, all of those managers would have really benefited from having read this book and applying its lessons, right? And again, the only one who I think would have been really good had he been able to focus on solely being a manager was the one who had read this book and did actually apply its lessons. And so I think although that kind of parade of poor managers I had, I think Kim Scott saw those people too and thought, you know what, we really need a playbook for these people. So yeah, I think I was applying a lot of I was projecting a lot onto this book. And after kind of being able to take a step back and being like, no, let me just think about this as a management philosophy. It's a good book. And I think more people would benefit from reading it.
Yeah. It reminds me that and it's not just a radical candor problem. There's other frameworks, right? So I'm a big fan of Dave Ramsey. And people call in. I'm like, I love it. It's one of my guilty pleasures. I'll watch like the Dave Ramsey highlights on YouTube.
I do enjoy a good call-in show.
And a lot of times people come in real tangled up and be like, oh, the system's not working or this or that. And they'll go through and he's got these baby steps that are like very clear 7-step process, and they do it out of order. And that's one of the like critical steps of doing the Dave Ramsey plan is you have to do it step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, like absolutely in order. If you do it out of order, it gets really confusing. It's too many plates that you're spinning. It's too crazy. Even if you're following the step, you're just doing it in the wrong order. And I think this is similar in that some of these pieces feel counterintuitive. And if you don't understand the context of why you need to give immediate feedback right after a meeting, or that the purpose of a one-to-one is not to give a status update, the purpose of a one-to-one is to give this sort of two-way street of feedback. And a lot of it should be, and all of it actually should be driven by the person that's reporting to you, right? Like there's these kind of like core concepts that we'll get into that if you don't do that, right? If you just make your one-to-ones a status update and then nobody ever really says anything honest to each other, and then you go 6 months goes by and they've missed all their OKRs and you don't, you haven't set clear expectations, and the next thing you know, you give them a pip. Well, what have you been doing? Like you haven't been doing anything that the system gave you. And now you're saying, oh, I use Radical Candor. And like, did you? Like there's all these like, and so I think that's the part where you're like, if you're going to identify with the system, you really should understand the system. Otherwise you're kind of cargo culting. In the same way that I've walked into so many shops and they go, oh, we do, we have CI/CD in place. And you're like, do you though? Like, do you actually have these, automated test and deploy processes? Like, you kind of have it. Maybe you have some GitHub actions working or something. But do you know how to do these deeper things? I think all of us, if we say we're using a system, you really should familiarize yourself with the system and understand like, what are you actually signing up for?
Well, let's get into it then. We've got part 2. So part 2, like you talked about, Nathan, if part 1 is kind of the philosophy, part 2 is titled Tools and Techniques. And so it's divided into 4 different chapters, and kind of techniques for each area of Radical Candor. So chapter 5 is relationships, establishing trust with direct reports. Chapter 6 is guidance, getting, giving, encouraging praise and criticism. Chapter 7 is team, avoiding boredom and burnout. And chapter 8 is results, getting stuff done together faster. And as a reminder of Radical Candor, the base, I guess the kind of core idea behind Radical Candor is care personally, challenge directly. And so she has kind of like a quadrant system. And so you can see if care personally is the y-axis and challenge directly is the x-axis, then if you care personally but do not challenge directly, that is ruinous empathy, which we talked a lot about last week. You don't want to be seen as a jerk. You end up really hurting people's careers. If you don't care personally and don't challenge directly, you wind up with manipulative insincerity. This is the one that gets talked about the least. How would you summarize manipulative insincerity, Nathan?
Ooh. So unfortunately, I've witnessed this.
Okay.
This is the kind of person who, imagine, well, I think The Emperor's New Clothes outlines this perfectly, where, no one really believes the emperor has these beautiful clothes, right? But everyone acts like they do because it's actually the easiest to do this. It's completely insincere, right? You're really just trying to power grab. You're really just trying to do these things. And yeah, so it's this, there's no empathy whatsoever, but you're also, and so maybe the king then starts getting more and more demanding of like more and more absurd and crazy things because everyone's acting like, this, everything's normal. And so I think that there's forms of that where I've seen this where it's like, I look around the room and I'm like, everyone knows that this is not legitimate. And yet maybe they want to keep their job or they want to do these other things. And at least that was my interpretation, but they don't really talk about it too much actually in the book. You're right.
Yeah, they spend a lot more time with that ruinous empathy quadrant, and then the quadrant where you challenge directly, but you do not care personally, and that is obnoxious aggression.
Right.
Which I think we all have an experience.
The jerk boss, right?
Exactly.
The jerk boss, though, that gets stuff done, right? Like
it's true. It's true.
And they talk about this, right? They're like, most people, when asked, they would actually rather the jerk boss who gets things done than the ruinous empathy boss who's like just completely incompetent, but wants to be everybody's best friend. The Michael Scott,
Absolutely.
right?
Right.
But Michael Scott's ruin is empathy.
Yeah, when I was reflecting across my 7 managers at Silicon Valley companies, that was the one where I said, you know what, this one clearly did the worst job, was the one that I liked personally the most.
Yeah.
And again, it's because at least I think there was one who did just objectively a worse job. Like, he was, not only was he incompetent, but he also wasn't nice and was hard to have a conversation with. But at the same time, because he rubbed me the wrong way personally so much, I knew to be on my guard. Like, he at least was doing me that kindness. The one who was just totally in ruinous empathy, like, it's way worse because you don't even know to be on your guard. You don't even have the alarm bells going off of like, I shouldn't trust this guy. And so, like, yeah, like,
Yeah.
weirdly enough, that's the worst one. Anyhow, so if you care personally and challenge directly, as is the thesis of this book, you wind up with radical candor. So yeah, that's just a summary again of kind of what radical candor is all about. So now we get into our actual tools and techniques for radical candor. And I guess we can start with chapter 5. We got relationships, establishing trust with direct reports. What are your thoughts, your key takeaways from this chapter, Nathan?
Yeah. This one I actually spent a little extra time thinking about. So I'm not technically a manager in my role, but I do kind of halfway manage. And you'll see this happen in some companies where I'm technically the tech lead, but I'm also kind of in a management role
Right.
unofficially. And so while this doesn't, she'll talk about, oh, this much of your week needs to be dedicated to all this stuff. I'm not really, my performance is not based off of the performance of these other people, but I do have some sort of like hybrid roles. And so I do have one-to-ones with these guys, for instance. And I've actually been kind of sloppy in how we structure our one-to-ones. And this was like a really nice reminder of like, this is actually for relationship cultivation. One of the things I loved, she framed it, and I could strongly answer yes to either one of these, which is the coffee test, I think is what she called it, which is, would you go grab coffee with this direct report given the opportunity? If there's like this sort of impromptu, hey, you want to go grab coffee? Would that be reciprocated? Would the two of you like love to go grab coffee and catch up? She's arguing that if you don't have that relationship, that you're completely missing out. Like, you don't actually understand what's going on in your team, which I thought was a good framing. And I also, I think she also refers to one-to-one meetings as like sacred time, which I don't think I ever thought of one-to-ones as sacred time.
Yeah.
And again, I've had some companies in which one-to-ones were something I looked forward to every week. And I've had companies where I've worked in that one-to-ones were something I kind of dreaded. Like, I was just like, this is the ritual we're doing. It's kind of silly. But I think if I kept them focused like it's expected in Radical Candor, it's a real opportunity to dig into some juicy stuff that you don't have any opportunity to do otherwise, right? It's like a very specific type of catch up that you're doing. And I would love to know, like, on the relationships chapter, did one-to-one stand out to you, or what was the thing that was important to you in this?
I mean, I'm very pro one-to-one. I've seen engineers kind of, and so I remember when I first worked at my first job out of college, which was like a big entertainment company, and kind of seeing my manager, like, he would kind of like on one-to-one day, he didn't have his own office, and we kind of just like go on a walk with someone and then come back and get the next person. And I was always surprised that some of the more senior engineers, like, they just say like, oh, I don't have anything to discuss this week. And he'd be like, okay. And then like move on. And I kind of was like, why would you pass up your one-to-one? Like, this is your chance to really to grow your career. And then as I've gotten older, I've kind of recognized that, like, we talked about this last week, the idea of like rock star and superstars. Like, people are at different, you're not always a superstar or always a rock star. Some people are, I guess, but like a lot of times you move in different phases. And I could see some of these older engineers I was working with who were a little like, hey, I've kind of done what I wanted. Like, I've gotten to where I want. This is kind of the job I just want to have. And so I have a ton to talk about. But I've always been very pro one-to-one. I feel like it's where you can, you can get a lot of value, a lot of connection. You can really make sure you and your boss are on the same page about what you're wanting out of your job. but I've now also never been in the position where I have been on the opposite side of a one-to-one. I've always been an individual contributor. So yeah, I really like them. I thought it was interesting when they were talking about one-to-ones, and like the whole point of one-to-ones is, like you said, like you can kind of cargo cult it and be like, this is just something we do. But the whole point is to grow that relationship and establish trust. One thing I really liked her talking about, she was talking about dreams, like asking your
Yeah.
reports about their dreams, which I thought was kind of interesting. I'll read directly from the chapter. Talks about her friend Russ, who is managing a large team, and so he's trying to figure out like, okay, how do I encourage these people? I believe this was, and then it's funny because you pointed out that this book is fun to read after we read In the Plex, because we have an understanding of kind of what was going on at Google around this
Yep.
time. And I surmise from this book, I believe what's going on here is that Google had just acquired DoubleClick, which, if you remember, was like the big online advertising network. And Russ takes over the team of the DoubleClick salesmen and is really, really critical that Google retains this DoubleClick team at least for a couple years, or else the whole acquisition can kind of fall apart. And the salesmen are feeling kind of like burned out or skeptical joining Google. And so that's Russ's job here. It's like, okay, how do I retain these people? And so he starts asking about not just their long-term visions, but their dreams. And so this is what she says. She says, Russ tried asking Todd to describe his long-term vision for his career. Todd said what he thought Russ wanted to hear. Essentially, he wanted to be just like Russ when he grew up. Russ laughed. That's not ambitious enough. I'm not even sure I want this job. You want more. You deserve more. Todd wasn't budging. Russ tried another tack. Okay, that's one vision, but nobody really knows what they want to do when they grow up. Give me another vision. This time, Todd confessed he wanted to be more like a mini Jack Welch than a Russ Laraway, i.e., to be a CEO, but perhaps not a Fortune 500 CEO. Russ knew he was getting somewhere now. Something similar happened when we tried this again with another person, Sarah. First, she said she wanted to be like Russ. Then she talked about another larger ambition. What about another vision? Russ asked. A CAD, I don't swear, a crazy butt dream. Now Sarah said what she really wanted to do was to start a spirulina farm. Well, what spirulina, Russ learned, is a superfood. Now Russ was intrigued. How was a job persuading people to use DoubleClick to serve their ads going to help Todd become a mini Jack Welch, or Sarah to manage a spirulina farm? So I thought that was really, really interesting, that like not just understanding what your reports want directly out of this job, or even what they kind of imagine the next 18 months to look like, but like what are they trying to get out of their entire life, and how that can kind
Yeah.
of help frame a job. I don't know. Is this a little too woo woo? Is this what do you
I
think?
love this. So one of the things that stuck out to me was the amount of confidence that you have, that you want these people to potentially grow up and get out of the company that you're in. And I think this is sort of like a scarcity versus prosperity sort of
Right.
worldview. And Google seems to actually cultivate this quite well, which
Hmm.
is, hey, we, and I think one of the things that they frame in this book, which is kind of cool, is, oh, well, I think the woman in the story, she was kind of beating herself up over trying to develop some skills that she was weak in, and really what he identified was that she needs to double down on some leadership skills that she needed, which was actually going to make her just stronger in general and also serve the team better, right? Be in these mentored roles that would actually, and I think what he figured out was, how do I help push them on a trajectory that gets them to their dreams, but along the way serves our team the best it can be. And that's cool leadership. Like when you see that, I go, man, I wish I had more managers like that were like that. That had really dug into getting me to say something that was a little vulnerable. Where do I see myself in a few years? And then instead of being like, oh, well, you're in the wrong job, right? Why are you here? If you want to be an entrepreneur one day or whatever, like, why are you here? Instead of being like, how do we harness those entrepreneur desires to our advantage, and then also help him on the path to doing what he ultimately wants to do. That's the kind of manager I would want to be as well, right? That's
Yeah.
that's really good.
I enjoyed this. I I'm pretty direct, and I know myself pretty well, and so I feel like I don't get kind of lost in like, I don't know what I want out of this job. and so I kind of come to my managers with this sort of stuff. I actually did this recently where I I was feeling, I don't know why, like well, I know actually what was going on. I was tired. I hadn't been sleeping enough. And when I get tired, like one of the things I do is I kind of get like existential and like a little mopey. And I was just feeling a little like, because I'm really enjoying my work right now, but I know this isn't where I want to be for the rest of my life. Like I have larger ambitions outside of this. And so I was just thinking like, man, am I doing the wrong thing? Am I in the wrong place? And I have entrepreneurial aspirations. And so what I did was I wrote down a list and like, what is everything I want to learn at my current company? Not just tech wise, but leadership wise, business wise. And I said, and I'm like, I should write all this down. And then at least I can know every day, as long as I'm making progress towards one of these things, I'm good. And then I know that maybe I'll leave the company before I learn all those things if the right opportunity comes up. But at the very least, I can kind of know that my time is not poorly spent as long as I'm learning one of these things. And so I wrote everything down. I got 36 things on the list. And so, I've been talking to my managers about that, saying basically like, as long as I'm learning one of these things, like I'm happy. But if I ever start feeling like I'm too bogged down in some forever task or something like that, I'm not making progress towards any one of these things, then I'm going to start feeling like my time isn't well spent here. But I was able to make that list because I have an idea of kind of what my dream is. Like I would love to start my own company and be, the technical CEO of it, right? That's a thing in particular. I have a lot of interest in kind of like the Utah startup scene, and Utah has a lot of like tech companies, but the Utah business model is kind of like make software that's good enough, usually like B2B software, and then hire an army of salespeople to sell it, right? And Utah's pretty successful at that model. But I would like to see more engineering driven companies out of Utah. Although we did just have a really great success story
Yeah.
here where DX, which I have never used. You've
Yeah,
used
I
DX,
I
Nathan?
rolled it out. Yeah, I rolled it
Okay,
out to our
yes.
engineering org. We had like 300 ICs at a company of about
Mhm.
700 people total. And I led, when I was on the platform engineering team, I led the DX initiative, and it was transformative. So what this tool
What does
is
DX
it,
do? Yeah.
yeah. So actually Nicole Forsgren, who was on
Yes.
forward in the book, the DevOps handbook, and is sort
Hmm.
of monumentally important for things like Accelerate, working with Gene Kim, and this is the Dora metrics, space
Yeah.
metrics. She's an advisor to this company,
Oh,
so that
cool.
was one of the kind of cool things. But they basically created this thing called the DX Core 4, and they are a platform engineering developer experience platform where you basically overlay qualitative and quantitative data. So this will, you'll gather up all the things like how many PRs, are being put out and how many things are being deployed to production. But then they would give these every 90 days, you would do a survey amongst the engineers in the company. And these would be like CSAT, which are the satisfaction scores, but it would also ask other questions on like how effective are things? Do you feel like you're getting interrupted a lot? Which parts are you think are the weakest? And so basically, if you've ever seen that, like the state of software surveys that come out from the GitHub and Stack Overflow and stuff, it's like that inside of your own company. And you also put your org chart on top of it, so you can see, like, for instance, for the platform side, we would say, okay, we know this team's high performing. They have lower bugs, shipped to production. Their cycle times are really low. Like, we're really happy with the shape of this team. Can I look at the behavior of this team versus one that's struggling and see if, like, what's the difference in the way that they answered the surveys, or
Hmm.
what's their cadence of how they're working? And it's not one of these where you're like, oh, well, they do 5 PRs per engineer per week, and this other team's not doing that, and so we need to like crack the whip. It's not that at all. It's this idea that, well, you know what? This other team, they actually complain that they're interrupted. Well, they don't get deep focus time, right? Like I see this, like this team says like, oh, we get lots of deep focus time and we're doing all this cool stuff. This team over here. And so it's typically an opportunity for us to go in and talk to organizations and say, hey, look, I think the way you're structuring your work might be off, right? Like I think that the engineers feel disempowered, and it gave you things like predicting attrition, right? Like things that are really expensive to a company. Like you can kind of get indicators of which teams and individuals are flight risks. It gave you like all kinds of really good data.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so if the company actually cares, a platform like DX is meant to increase developer happiness, right? So it's not like there's some other companies that just measure developer productivity and you feel like you're a little automaton and you're like, oh man, I'm being surveilled all the time. This sucks. DX went to the other side of this and said, you know what? Why don't we make it we know what great engineering environments look like. Let's see how your company compares to it. And so the other cool thing was they would anonymize the data and compare your company to 50th percentile, 95th percentile.
Oh, interesting.
Across the industry. Yeah. So it was one of those things where like people were very skeptical, but when we rolled it out, it had a huge impact. And I was able to then, using real data to executive leadership, say, this is why this part of the company is struggling, right? Mm-hmm. You guys, you kind of beat up on like, oh, they're never meeting their deadlines. They're never doing this thing. And I'm like, the data shows us this. The data shows us this is what functional teams look like. And this is the one that they're complaining about. And so, anyway, they just got acquired by Atlassian. That was just
$1 billion. They have about 100 employees.
Yeah, they were crazy, and they had actually I knew a lot about them because so actually, to full disclosure, they did a case study on my time at Flyer. There's actually if you look up Nathan Toups DX, there's like a little blog case study of like us using DX. So I'm a fanboy, and I've actually stayed in communication with those folks. And they've kept a really tight knit team. Their CTO is amazing. Their CEO is amazing. They have a really great Substack called Engineering Enablement, which is like nice. Just a really good newsletter in general. And so I don't know. I'm a huge fan. I think whatever they do, either in DX or any of the leadership, if they go off to do other things, it was funny because Nicole Forsgren actually just announced that she took a position at Google like 2 days ago. So like right before the announcement for DX, which I mean, I think it makes probably more sense now, but or maybe it was just coincidence. I don't know. But anyway, these are the kind of people that you keep track of. Like keep track of Gene Kim, keep track of Nicole Forsgren, Abby, who's the head of the CEO DX, Laura Taco, who's the CTO. I follow those people; they're awesome.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just kind of learning about them, but I was excited to hear about them because, again, they kind of break the Utah tech business model, where they are really engineering driven, really developer focused. That's the kind of company I would love to build one day. But it helps if you have a kind of idea of like, okay, what is your dream? Because it can kind of guide you to know what you want to do in your career. But not a lot of people think that way, or if maybe they just don't have the time to introspect, or it doesn't come naturally. And so that's what Kim Scott is talking about in this book, is that is one of your jobs as a leader. That's one of your jobs. That's how you care personally, is you need to understand not just what your report wants out of this sprint cycle, but and not even just what they want out of the next 18 months of their career, although she talks about how that's important too, because that's kind of the concrete next steps. But what do they want out of life in general? Even if that is just, not working, right? Like, because even that will influence kind of the choices you make in your career or how you perform. So yeah, I thought that was all interesting. Any other thoughts on chapter 5, Nathan, relationships, or do you want to move on to chapter 6, guidance?
Yeah, let's move on to chapter 6.
Okay, so we got guidance, getting, giving, encouraging, praise, and criticism. She talks about, she kind of says there's an order of operations here. It says 1, and this is very important, before you can give feedback, you need to solicit feedback. You need to show that you are the kind of person who values feedback. And she says you have to solicit feedback sincerely. When you get feedback, you need to actually act on it. And she also says, like, you have to be pretty persistent in soliciting feedback from people. Like she says, you got to be comfortable with the silence. Like she recommends 6 seconds of silence. So you say something like, is there anything I can start doing or stop doing that would make your job easier? And she says, wait, 6 seconds of silence. And then after that, you have to keep pushing. Like, come on, I'm telling you, there's got to be something. She says a lot of people won't give anything, which is why it makes it so important when someone does give something that you have to act on it immediately, because otherwise, like, people aren't going to trust you. You ever worked with a boss that's been really good at acting on feedback?
No, actually. Never once did a boss ask me this directly.
Yes.
I will say though, I did it this week.
Okay,
So
there you
I
go.
I had my first, sort of focused one-on-one. We have a junior dev on our team, and so this is his first real engineering job after college. And I was like, I'm not doing any good service if I'm not showing him what to expect, and we're not trying to dream big about where he wants to go. And I'm not being, a good mentor and sponsor and these kind of things on top of that. And so he was obviously really sheepish to give me an answer. And I literally just used the tactics here, right? And I was just like, brought it up again, gave the silence, which, for a person like me, 6 seconds of silence feels like, 2 minutes of silence. And, but it was really good. Something actually came out of it. He, one of the things was, we have a tendency to go off and work in silos, which is just very natural to the company culture, actually. And I think maybe some of this has to do with the fact that we're doing a lot of open source work. A lot of people just go off and do their own thing. But we've actually had he pointed out quite well that we've actually had some nice breakthroughs when we've done pair programming and sort of mob programming on certain juicy problems. And that I should lead in making a concerted effort to do this on a regular basis. And I thought that was incredibly healthy feedback, right? That really it wasn't just something that can come from the ground up, that this is something that we need to set as a culture for our team and, how we work with others. And I thought that was really great. And so it's the first one, right? Like we're going to dive deeper later over time. But I didn't realize how important that was. We'd done it a few times, but I didn't realize how important it was to him until he gave me that feedback. Like, I like working this way. I feel like it stops a lot of back and forth and that I can actually move faster and it helps me understand the code base better. And, it was really, I thought it was a really cool piece. And it actually opened up other sort of conversations about what he's looking for and, where does he see himself going? And I didn't realize how powerful, yes, what could I do or stop doing to make it easier for you to work with me? It's like a very clear scripted sentence, but I highly recommend giving it a try if you're in a position like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've worked with some managers that are really good about acting on feedback when you give it to them, which works well for me because I tend to be fairly open and direct,
Right.
but a lot of people aren't. And so I think if you're a manager, you might be saying like, "Oh yeah, well I do great when people give me feedback," but I think you got to ask yourself, "Well, how often are you soliciting feedback?"
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, she talks about next giving praise. And I thought this was very interesting about her advice on giving praise. She said, your praise needs to be specific and sincere. I mean, sincere, I think we all get. No one wants hollow praise. But she talked a lot about how your praise should be as specific as your criticism. Um, maybe I'll be able to, over the course of this conversation, look up her example because she has some good examples here. But yeah, I don't know. How do you feel about this? Because she talked about how if your praise isn't specific, it can feel hollow. I don't know if I agree with that so much. Like I like a good attaboy every now and again, but
Yeah.
obviously it lands better when it's specific.
I think specificity, and we learned this in Made to Stick, right? Specificity actually goes way further,
Uh-huh.
always. And I think I do like to give praise. And I typically do specific praise, but I will know if I'm being sloppy, I'll just be like, "Oh, that was a great job." Oh, in that presentation, it was a great job. Where that's not that useful. Where I go, you know what? Um, I'm gonna say Tom has been pretty skeptical of this project, and I could tell that from Tom's questions that he's really engaged, and so I really like what you did in that presentation. I think that because you framed it this way, it was really useful, and I think you should make sure to make time for that in the future, right? Way better piece of praise, right? Instead of just like, oh, you did a great job. That they go back and go, you know what? Nathan saw that I actually put in the effort to do this. And because a lot of times they'll go, you know what? I was concerned about Tom. And that was exactly what I was thinking. I'm glad it landed, right? We have candor. That is a real trust relationship that we're building. They took my feedback. I took their feedback. They listened. This is what a healthy environment looks like. If I just said good job, they probably would go, yeah, I did do a good job. Like, I'm glad you thought that too, but it doesn't land nearly as much, right?
Yeah, she mentions like a lot of people try to make sure that they have the facts straight before giving criticism, but you spend just as much time making sure you have the facts straight before giving praise.
Yeah.
Which again is I think in our made to stick framework, to me that kind of falls squarely in like uncommon sense.
Yes.
Like oh, I've been thinking about that idea a lot because of that. Like it surprised me. I was like, oh, that's interesting that you would view praise as something you need to be very certain about. She gives an example with her co-founder Russ, where he's a little league coach, and she says that she kind of offhandedly tells him like, "I really admire that you're a little league coach," and he says thanks, but then he said usually that would have been that, but I realized later that my compliment had not been specific. I hadn't told Russ why I admired that he was a coach. I mentioned the irony to Russ. He replied, well, the real problem is that I don't think you meant it. You hate sports. Now I realized it was even worse than I thought. It wasn't just that I'd been vague and helpful. He knew I cared about him, but he thought my praise was insincere. So she's saying this is kind of how you you avoid the manipulative insincerity quadrant. Being specific can help you be sincere,
Yep.
or at least sound more sincere, convey the sincerity you really actually feel. And so she gives an example. She says, the other day I gave you a hard time about leaving early for practice, and I felt bad about it. Because in fact, I really admire that you're a little league coach. You do as good a job integrating your work in your life as anyone I know. I always wonder if I'm spending enough time with my kids, and the example you set by coaching helps me to do better. Also, the things you've learned from the Positive Coaching Alliance, which is something we read about and made to stick, have been enormously helpful in our work. So that's an example of like unspecific praise versus specific praise. And I also think another thing, because this kind of ties in with one of the techniques she talks about, she says 2-minute conversations. You got to give feedback immediately between meetings in the moment. You can't save everything up for your one-on-ones and then kind of dump on people. And I thought this was an example of like, I think it'd be really weird to be like in a one-on-one that starts with like 5 praise statements that are all kind of formatted like this. Like that would kind of feel like robotic. But if this
Right.
is something that's happening like in between conversations, like, I don't know. I think that makes a little more sense and feels a little less weird. What do you think?
Yeah, no, exactly. And so it's funny, I talked about this sort of like tech debt feedback thing. That was actually I didn't make it clear. Those were notes that I took because we're all virtual and remote. The
Right.
2-minute conversation after a meeting is an easy thing to do if you're in person, right? You're
Totally.
walking out of the room and I can be like, hey, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of times I'll write down specific feedback. And the reason I was saying this was like, if I let the same feedback get written in my notebook twice, but it was based off of this 2-minute conversation idea.
Right.
Because I was like, oh, I'm actually generating tech debt. Like this is actually like feedback debt is how I was thinking about it. I think this is like a really interesting idea though of like, she puts all these formal processes in place, but then she also kind of in this technique section is like, hey, don't wait for these like things. Like if there's an opportunity to do feedback, do it immediately. Like the praise and criticism thing is a perfect example too. Let's say you did have a piece of criticism. And I think this is where that insult to injury thing could come up. If I just said, hey, you did a great job on the presentation, but I really think that you should stop interrupting Alice. Alice tried to ask a question, and I think you preempted what she was going to ask, but she didn't get to finish asking it. And you just assumed that you knew what she was asking, and she looked a little frustrated, right? Like that would be the criticism. That would have taken a lot better if I said, you did a great job on the presentation. Tom's finally coming around. Like I can see that you put a lot of effort to address this because he was very skeptical in the last meeting. But I wanted to give you feedback that Alice, you kept interrupting her and you filled in the gap and you didn't give her a chance to finish asking her question. She looked really frustrating. Which of those pieces of criticism would you take better, right? I just gave you a very specific example of how you pulled Tom in, and I'm really happy about that. But I think if I had just given the generic good job on the report and then talked about Alice, you'd be like, wait a minute, then I didn't do a good job. Like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And so I think, and again, that's not manipulative. That's you not being sloppy. You had a very specific feedback about interrupting Alice, but you also need to give specific praise. Otherwise, you really do risk the reputational harm there.
Well, and one thing she points out is that most people want more feedback than you think they do, which I think is totally true. We think about this.
I do, right?
Absolutely, right? Again, it's like we talked about last week. Like by far, the biggest quadrant and the most career-ruining quadrant is ruinous empathy. You kind of know what you're getting when you have obnoxious aggression. But ruinous empathy, and that comes from people who are too scared to give feedback. And I'm probably like, why are you a manager? to being a developer, being like, I'm scared to write code. And but with feedback, we talk about this with parenting, my wife and I, which is, I think she read in some book somewhere, but it's like the roller coaster philosophy of parenting, which is that like when you get on a roller coaster and you put the lap bar down, you will push it up like instinctively. And what you're doing is making sure that it stays.
Right.
And like that's what kids do a lot. Like they'll act out and they'll push boundaries, not because they would even be happier getting what they want, but because they're trying to kind of like push and see where are the limits. And then by giving them boundaries, you help them feel safe and secure. I
Exactly.
think there's a similar thing going on here with feedback, where it's like you can think you're being nice by like never being feedback or always being their buddy, but people want feedback. I want feedback. I want to know how I'm doing. I want to know if I'm on track for my big dreams, for my goals at this particular company. And if you never get feedback, like you're not actually helping your employees.
Yeah. So I was framing this a little bit in that one-to-one earlier this week. I'm going to bring this up again, kind of giving the basic, a variation of the example given in the first half of the book about having spinach on your teeth, right? And I think
Right.
this is a great story because it's like, it's one that we've all experienced, right? You have spinach on your teeth, and nobody purposefully has spinach on their teeth, and it's very distracting. And, but have you ever been at a party where you have spinach on your teeth and nobody said anything, right? You're sitting there going, I ate a salad 20 minutes ago. I've had spinach on my teeth for 20 minutes. I've talked to 5 different people. No one said a freaking thing that I had. And finally, maybe somebody tells me, or I go to the bathroom and realize there's spinach on my teeth. Now there's a way to be a real jerk and giving feedback and be like, oh, somebody's been enjoying the salads like in front of everyone. And you can be a real jerk and kind of embarrass them. Or you can kind of pull them to the side and be like, hey, you got spinach on your teeth. Just like giving you a heads up. Just, kind of knock that off and then let them get back to doing their things. That's part of the goal here, is that you want them to bring their best self to the party. You don't want to, they're already doing a great job, but there's something so distracting that people are just like, this is kind of weird. And so this is the purpose, is that we can give little pieces of feedback that just kind of help you operate at a higher level, right? It doesn't even have to mean fix a character flaw or something. It could just be like, oh, some tactical thing that you're doing wrong. Well, you need to give that feedback if you have the ability to do this. And so that was one of the things I was talking to him in this one-to-one about. It was just like, hey, this is what I want. I want this culture in which you can give me feedback, I can give you feedback, with the goal of us being the best versions of ourselves. And so yeah, I love this stuff. I think that this is sort of the guidance piece. Is if you have this high trust environment, you can give guidance and it's received, right? Because the other thing I hate is unsolicited advice, right? Sometimes somebody will come in and like give me
Right.
a pointer, and I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to be an entrepreneur one day. And they're like, oh, yeah, well, I'll tell you what to do. And I'm like, you've worked in a government job your entire life.
Yeah.
Like, why would I take entrepreneurship advice from you? And so, yeah, I think it's important to have that context.
Well, that takes us to chapter 7, team and avoiding boredom and burnout. A couple points here. One is that idea of rock stars and superstars, and she calls it the problem of permanent markers, which is that like you're not always going to be a rock star, you're not always going to be a superstar. You'll drift in between, uh, sometimes from job to job, sometimes even at the same job. She talks in particular about personal life affecting it. Like you'll see this happen a lot, where someone might be really motivated and have a lot of fire in their belly earlier in their career, and then they get married and they have kids, and then they kind of settle down and fall a little more into a rock star. I kind of did the opposite, where I had kids really young, and so by the time I got my first job out of college, my son was like a year and a half, and so kind of I was more I was consumed with that, and I was doing things like getting my master's degree, and it's kind of only been very recently finishing the master's degree and things have kind of stabilized around home that I've had a lot more energy to put in my career, and I feel like I'm more on the superstar trajectory than the rock star one. But I'm just sharing that as an example of like people drift in and out. You're not always a superstar. You're not always a rock star. Um, and yeah, so and just making sure that you have things for both of those people to do.
Yeah. Um, th- I was surprised by this chapter in the book because I think that if you, as a leader, are concerned with avoiding the boredom and burnout aspect of this, Radical Candor really comes from a really wonderful place. I think that this is the kind of idea of like, yes, this again, some of this seems a little alien to me because I'm not from that Harvard Business School,
Right.
McKinsey background. But if your heart really is in this, how do we grow and cultivate, and that boredom and burnout, they really do, they're just so bad for everybody, right? They're bad for the team, they're bad for you. You can get really cynical, and this is where you can kind of feel stuck. This is where you can kind of feel resentful, like all these things that nobody wants. And she makes up a really good point in here, basically saying that you owe it to them to not let them be in this position, right? Like that if they're underperforming consistently, it's not that they're a bad person. And it's not
Right.
that necessarily that you're even a bad manager. You are a bad manager if you let them stay there, right? Like the idea is set those expectations, but also help them figure out what they actually want. That this was like this is kind of an eye-opening thing to me of like, if a manager sees an employee struggling, don't just vilify them, put them on a pip and kick them out. It's really just like giving them the feedback saying like, hey, I don't think this is a good fit for you. And this is why. Not in a passive aggressive way, but just being like,
Right.
I think you need a different, we're not in alignment with what is making you excited. And I think you can do this in a very disingenuous way where you're trying to cover your butt as a manager. But I think you could also do it in a way that's like super amazing and might be the eye-opening wake-up moment for them being like, you know what? I'm doing this because I thought the narrative was really nice, but actually I don't want to do this at all. I want to go be a ship. I want to be a captain of a boat, and I don't want to work in tech at all, right? You're like, hey, you should go do that because this is an awful way to be a captain of a boat. You don't want to be here if that's what you want to do in life.
I was actually thinking about one of my bosses I had back in college who had a great radically candid moment with me where so back in college I sold football and basketball tickets for BYU athletics over the phone. And so it was like a commission based job, and we would call people who had bought like a single game ticket in the past and like try to upsell them on a season ticket, or we call season ticket holders and try to upsell them on, it's called the Cougar Club membership, which is like it's a donation but then it gives you extra perks like priority seating or a parking pass, things like that. So I was working that job, and our shift started at 8:30 in the morning. Um, and I struggled with being late, not very late. Like we had kind of like our morning stand up at 8:35, but I would frequently show up around like 8:33 or 8:34. Like it's something I've just never been good at in my life, and it's why I've selected into tech, which does not value uh, extreme punctuality. Um, and but I was just a little late. And I kind of thought it was no big deal. My boss had kind of told me like, you should be here on time. Like, okay, okay. But in my mind, I kind of turned to like, I am here on time. I'm here before the meeting starts, right? And eventually, he sat me down and he said, he's like, you need to be here at 8:30. He said, and if you do not show up at 8:30, he said, I will fire you. He says, and not because I don't like you, not because he's like, I think you're a good salesman. He said, but I will fire you to teach you this lesson so you do not make this mistake again in life when it's more important than it is at this college job. And I was like, whoa. And so from then on, I was on time. I made sure to be there, before 8:30 every single day. Um, but it only helped because he was radically candid, and it was a perfect example of caring personally and challenging directly.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it was a huge challenge. Him saying, like, bringing out the big guns, like, this is important. And I will fire you if you don't meet this. But he tied it in with that care personally dimension of him saying, like, I will do this for your own good. Um, her kind of radical candor story, she mentions in the first half of the book, is she adopts like this like golden retriever puppy. And she loves it, but is very, very soft with it and is not disciplined. And so she's like at like a stoplight, and like the dog is like yanking on the leash and like and she's like, oh, it's okay, Sparky or whatever the dog is, like, it's okay, don't worry, just wait for the light. And the dog is just not listening. And the man standing next to her says, I can see you care for your dog. But if you don't train him, you're going to get him killed. And then he says to the dog, in a commanding voice, he says, sit. And then the dog sits. And he says, it's not mean, it's clear. And he just walks off. And she points that out as a great example of like, he established that he cared personally. He says, I can see you care for your dog a lot. But then he also challenged her directly. And she said that, and it was because he cared personally that he challenged directly. If you don't care, if he didn't care about this woman or about the dog, he would just said like, yeah, this woman doesn't know how to handle her dog, and moved on with his day. So yeah, I think, and she talks about that in this back half of the book too, which is that it can be really helpful when you're trying to like implement radical candor in your career and with your reports, sharing your radically candid story. Basically, like when is a moment when someone was radically candid with you that it made a big impact on you, and it can help your reports understand like, oh, that's why they're trying to do this, because it really helped them and they think it'll really help me too.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a great story. I know I've had folks. I had one. It wasn't the do this, show up at 8:30 or you're fired standpoint. But again, the best manager I've ever had was did practice the radical candor piece. And I remember I had just joined the team, and all the software engineers, they did 2-week sprint cycles, and actually we had really good rituals around. It was one of those where it was kind of the Scrum process, but they followed it to a T. And so it wasn't this annoying thing. It was actually just like a really good way to understand what everybody had on their plate. We were really good at estimating stuff. It was one of the rare times that I actually didn't mind the process and thought people really understood what they were doing. But I was doing SRE, like site reliability engineering stuff, and kind of slipping into a lot of DevOpsy type things. But some of them were bigger software initiatives that I was actually writing code on the API backend and doing some other kind of cool stuff. But I was kind of skirting around the process. Like I wasn't always making tickets for myself. I wasn't always estimating properly. I wasn't, making sure that I had a good backlog prioritization and coordinating. And he pulled me aside and he was just like, hey, I noticed that you had worked on this ticket and you just like put it in the done column. I was like, oh yeah, I didn't want to be like annoying to other people. And he's like, no, he's like, we have this process in place so that we can trust each other. And if I don't know that someone else didn't, do a code review of the things that you're working on, I can't take you seriously as someone part of the software team. Like you're just going to be doing ops work, right?
Right.
This is what this is. If you actually want to do SRE, you follow the process like everybody else. And it was very like humbling because I was just like, I had skirted around it, and I was just used to kind of doing hustle stuff when we were tiny. We were putting all this formal structure in place. And I never skirted the process again. He didn't say fix this or you're done, right?
Right.
But it was definitely one of these pieces where like I expect this level of behavior if you're going to be taken seriously. And he knew I wanted to be taken seriously. He knew that I wanted to be a part of the team in that way. And and then after that, I operated within those boundaries, and it was actually really cool because then I got to have like really like better discussions, and I'd get good feedback and all the other things that you wanted. And so I always really appreciated that. And yeah, there are other managers who could have just been like, oh yeah, Nathan just skirts around the rules and doesn't really do what he's asked in. And eventually he's like, well, we had this production outage because you don't follow the rules, and like been real passive aggressive. But no, he just fixed it back when it was just a procedural thing, and then it never was a problem again.
Yeah, we had a similar thing kind of play out at work where we had a big project we had to deliver, and we were debating kind of like what the deadline would be. And I had an engineer who was a little hesitant to set a deadline because obviously it's hard to estimate engineering work, and kind of what I said, I'm like, this project has a deadline, whether it's explicit or implicit. That's our decision, right? And implicit deadlines suck so much worse than explicit deadlines. Like
Right.
I had that at a project I worked on at a company where I was working on this thing. I hadn't been given an explicit deadline for it. And so I was working on this thing, and I think I'd said like it would take like 12 weeks. But then it kind of like stretched and grew into more. And I kind of thought like, well, we're learning things, and there was unforeseen tasks. And so it's okay. We're still moving along. And so I finally got the thing done. And it took closer to like like 6 months with maybe actually 4 months of active development work. Then we were kind of waiting on other people for some things, and it was done. And I was really proud. And I was like, hey, this is great. Like, I'm really glad we got this thing done. And my boss wasn't. And I was like, well, what's wrong? Like, it's done. He's like, Carter, if I had known this thing would take 6 months instead of 3 months, I wouldn't have done it. Like, it's not worth 6 months. And that really shocked me because I was just kind of like, but I was engineering. I was working the whole time. And so doesn't that mean I was doing a good job? But like, that was frustrating. It would have been kinder of him to say, this thing needs to be done in 3 months. It's not worth it if it's not done in 3 months. And so hustle, get it done in 3 months. Like, because it was way more annoying to find out after the fact that this thing that I thought I'd done a good job on, I thought I should be proud of, was actually viewed as like time wasted.
Yeah.
But again, that whole idea of like, it's not mean, it's clear.
Right.
Well, maybe we can talk about chapter 8. This is about results, getting stuff done together faster. This really gets at the heart with managers, kind of her talking about like, okay, well, if you have all this new stuff you're supposed to do to be radically candid, is this just consuming all your time? Like, when do you actually do your job? She talks about like kind of at Google, the performance review culture, like where it would take like basically twice a year, it took about 40 hours to kind of get all your performance reviews done. But like your job doesn't stop during performance review season. And so you're just like, it's like you have a second job for like 2 weeks out of the year. And so she's saying like, okay, well, how can you actually get stuff done? And how can you as a team get stuff done faster? Lots of stuff here. I guess I'll just touch on, she talks about the importance of debating and deciding. So basically creating space for disagreement, but also knowing when to cut off the debate. And this was a point I thought was really interesting. She says, you need to make it really clear to your team, when are you debating and when are you deciding?
Yeah.
And right. She says, making it really clear that you're just debating and not deciding. And I realize I've been in these positions before. If you're just debating, but you think you're actually deciding something, it can make the debate feel really high stakes. And it can make you kind of dig into your position because you feel like this is the time. If I don't make my points excellently right now and really push for my case, then I'm going to lose out on the decision. But then at the same time, sometimes you just have to decide and you're saying, okay, we've talked about this as much as possible. We're done evaluating the pros and cons. Right now, we're just going to make the decision. And that can get people out of kind of that debate space of like playing devil's advocate. And now it's time to actually make the decision. But I thought that was interesting because I think we kind of mesh debating and deciding into like, oh, this is just like the decision-making process. But it is important to separate the two out. And that gives people the space to disagree while at the same time letting them know, like, okay, here's where we're actually getting on board.
Yeah. Again, back with that, the best manager that I've ever had, it was the only company that I've ever seen that we had very clear debate and decide meetings. And it was the coolest experience that I ever had because we wrote an RFC. Somebody would write an RFC of like, and that's a request for comments of like something that you really cared about. You thought architecturally maybe needed to change, any sort of bigger software change. In this one, we were struggling with, and this is kind of like a fun engineering problem I'll touch on briefly. We were training these models for doing automated stock trading, and the data would change over time. But we needed to be able to have data that was reproducible, meaning we get minute by minute ticker data that would come in continuously. We had these like big data pipelines, and then we'd make decisions. But sometimes the stock market would make updates. Like there was a factual inaccuracy in some reporting for some quarterly data or something like this, and they would do amendments. Or maybe this acquisition would happen and the ticker name would change for something. And they would sort of make these adjustments. But what we needed to know is at a point in time, what did the data look like as of a certain date, right? So like I asked the data this question on October 1st. What did the world look like on October 1st versus November 15th? And so we had to structure the data in our database this like very particular way in which all the data was there, but I could also historically ask it, what did it look like at some point in the past? And so there was these very important columns. There was these like date range things or some other pieces and how we were doing these pipelines. But we ended up building out this very cool database in which you could actually basically imagine move a cursor over time and say, tell me, query the data as it was true on this date into the past. And it was like kind of a juicy, and it was one of those things where until you start really thinking about edge cases, it's actually like a pretty complicated thing with the understanding how the data feeds work and all these other pieces. And for us, it was really, I need a reproducibility of a model. So let's say we pick a model to do some trades on, and we find a bug or something in it. I actually, all of a sudden, what the world looked like at some point in the past becomes incredibly important. If we need to troubleshoot, we need to know that I can like grab that data set and know exactly what the world looked like. And so we ended up, we had this huge debate. I mean, it was like whether some date range should be date inclusive or date exclusive, and like how do we actually do the annotations, and what happens if these things happen in production, or what happens if we have these other issues. It was this huge thing back and forth, and just witnessing this was like, some of it felt very pedantic because it was like literally a column and some data type conversations. And then finally, it kind of felt like the dust had settled. And we came to a point to make a decision, and that was a separate meeting. We kind of looked at all the stuff that we'd been duking it out, and a decision was made, and that's what we did. This was like, this is the way that we deal with append only, cursor moving as of date stuff. And it was settled. And all of us could independently, with like commander's intent, all of us could independently go and apply this to all these other services that needed this kind of like pattern to it. And it was cool because all of a sudden you didn't have to have 15 debates about how do we do it in all these interesting implementations. We had kind of like settled this whole thing categorically and moved on. And I've had aspects of that in different organizations, but this was like the clearest thing where we're like, this is what real engineering looks like. This is really cool. And this is like a really like high trust, high productivity team around that.
Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself with the book, because now I'm kind of thinking about like, okay, well, who would I recommend this to? I mean, maybe we can kind of jump to our closing thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts kind of like around not just chapter 8, but like the general book at this point.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, any hot takes, anything about this? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, hot takes. That's a great one. I'm trying to think. Hot takes I have is, one of the hot takes I had was if more managers actually asked for feedback than gave feedback, I think workplaces would be a lot healthier. It kind of, if it's just it coming down, I think it's hard to take that feedback as much unless I feel like there's a two-way street, right?
Right.
Especially if a manager can drive you crazy sometimes. If I don't feel empowered to go back and give that feedback and feel like it's a safe place to give that feedback, there's this dysfunctional buildup over time. Another hot take I have, I guess, have you had that feeling? I mean, do you ever wish that you had a better relationship with a manager where you're like, I wish I could give feedback, but I don't really feel comfortable doing this?
Oh, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
And you just know, like, if you give feedback, like I've had the kind of the opposite, where like I am someone who gives feedback pretty willingly.
Right.
And I've just had it happen with managers, and like it just, either they react really poorly to it, or they just don't implement it at all. And then you just kind of, it's demoralizing. You're like, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to do, I'm not going to get anywhere here. For me, I think I have two kind of takes about this book. So one, this is a very minor thing, but the second edition of this book was done during like what I call peak woke, like kind of like that summer of 2020. And like, there are some things that sneak into it, which are like a little silly, I think.
It's annoying. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Just kind of like, as an example, look, the guy who writes Dilbert has some crazy opinions, right? And I've seen some of what he says, and I don't agree with everything that guy says. I think sometimes he's like off in La La Land, right? She references Dilbert in the book, which like Dilbert is a great comic strip, and especially like for us, like 9-to-5 white collar tech workers, like there's a lot you can read in Dilbert, and like it's a funny satire, right? But she can't just mention the Dilbert comic strip without also slamming Scott Adams, who writes Dilbert. And I'm a little like, it's fine. Like, you can disagree with Scott Adams. If you reference Dilbert, I'm not assuming you are implicitly endorsing everything Scott Adams has ever said or done. Like,
Right.
Dilbert can just be a funny comic strip. So there are a couple moments like that where it's a little like, eh.
He is cuckoo. I will say, like,
no, absolutely, right?
but
Like,
at the same time, yeah. And there's that sort of like, yeah, it's this sort of like hand wringing, half apology stuff that it's kind of become part of the fabric of Silicon Valley to kind of be like acknowledge your privilege, and all of a sudden you're like, yeah, you're saying these words, but what have you changed to actually make any differences?
Right.
There's still the not in my backyard and all these other problems that happen
Right.
in all these cities.
Are you do you too have strong feelings on zoning? We should talk about this.
Oh, well,
not on the podcast.
It's hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy that bothers me, right?
Yes.
So it's one of these things where you're like, oh, well, we need, low income housing to solve the housing problem, and you're like, cool, well, we need it in your neighborhood. Your downtown, San Francisco,
your Berkeley
we need it in your neighborhood.
Right.
They're like, oh, well, not my neighborhood. I just mean like generally, like, why don't we put on the edge of the suburbs? You're like, oh, okay, but why is it appropriate for them and not for you? Like, to me, it's the hypocrisy. Like, I do think housing there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of policy issues, but in the very same places that seem to like saber rattle about it a lot, it's like, oh yeah, well, well, anyway, that it's hypocrisy drives me nuts. Hypocrisy drives me nuts. I'm like, so there's no easy way to do it, but yeah.
And so in a as a pro for Kim Scott and not being a hypocrite, she actually does talk a lot in this book. She talks more about gender issues than race issues because she's a woman, so she's kind of coming from that background. And she does
really heartfelt stories that I was like, wow, that had to have been tough and horrible, like.
And she says, she's like, it's a problem. She's kind of talking about kind of like peak woke, saying that like managers feel uncomfortable challenging women because they feel like they're being too aggressive with them. And basically she has some great tips, and we can't get into all of them about like, okay, how do you handle this when there is a gender dynamic? But the point, she says, like, society has become too fraught and it's too hard to have these conversations, but it's not kind not to have them. And you still owe people, even you might need to be a little more tactful about it, but you still owe people challenging them directly. And so I was very impressed because, again, there's a little bit of hand wringing. There's a little bit of like covering your woke bases, so to speak, which like sounds super stupid. I know, but like you kind of get what I'm saying. That I was a little like, is this book talking out of both sides of the mouth? And she gets to that point and basically says like, no, it's still really important to be radically candid, even when there's tricky gender or race or culture issues. I'm like, you know what? That's really, really cool. So I a big thumbs up to Kim Scott there. And then I have another thought, but maybe we can talk about it kind of when we talk about who we would recommend this book to. So I guess first, let's say, what are we going to do differently in our career because we've finished Radical Candor?
Yeah. So this week, and I've already taken this advice, right? So is make sure to ask what could I do to stop? What could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? It's such a powerful question. I had committed. I'd actually written this earlier this week. I committed to doing this, and I actually did it yesterday. Day before yesterday. And it's super powerful. Highly recommend it. It's such an easy, simple thing to get started with. You don't even have to understand the rest of the context of the book. So I'll continue this.
Yeah, for me, it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but I do mean it sincerely, which is just care personally, challenge directly. And I think this book is actually a really great example of like the made-to-stick communication philosophy, because if you boil Radical Candor down to simple, what is the core idea of Radical Candor? It's this. It's care personally, challenge directly. And then the rest of the book is basically a collection of stories meant to instruct you, how do you actually implement this idea? And so what I really want to remember in my career are those two stories, her story and my story, as far as Radical Candor goes. Her story of her training the dog and the stranger at the stoplight giving her the advice. And then my story of my sales boss threatening to fire me if I didn't show up on time. Because both those stories, I think, really illustrate that these are people who cared personally, but they challenged directly. And I just want to make sure when I'm giving feedback that I'm coming from that direction where I do sincerely care about the person, but I'm also being direct in what I need to see from them. So yeah, I mean, I think this book does a really good job of kind of boiling its core idea down to something simple, and
Right.
then helping you understand that. Because like in kind of the anti-made to stick, you'd absolutely say radical candor is revolutionizing the workplace and transforming how individuals engage with each other in a sincere manner while maintaining the humanity of relationships. And then it's like, what does that even mean, right? So I saw you've given a laughing emoji to my who would I recommend this book to. Why don't you go first and then I will go second.
Yeah. So, I still, my advice for last week, I think, has not changed. New managers who are terrified of being mean and probably over optimized to ruin a sympathy, you absolutely need to read this book. Like, you just for your career and for the career of the folks that report to you. Tech workers, this book is so ubiquitous and it's been misapplied so many places. I think all of us really appreciate being able to understand how systems actually work, and Radical Candor is a system. So if you want to apply systems thinking to your organization, read the book, because it helps you understand. And there are some really good pieces in here that I think that, I came out of this book better for it.
Yeah, I would recommend this to same as last week to really basically any manager. But I think here's the trick with Radical Candor. You have to pretend that you have never heard of this book. You have to pretend that like you've walked into a bookstore, you've just seen this, you're the first person in the world to ever read this, because this book has absolutely become a victim of its own success. And
Yes.
Kim Scott is aware of that. That's the whole Silicon Valley joke, right? This guy talking about how he's practicing radical candor, but really he's just being a joke. And then like some old coworker or boss comes into the coffee shop and he like ducks under the table to hide from him, but insists that this is still part of radical candor, right? And like you can kind of, I think there are too many people who like say they practice radical candor but are just kind of jerks, or say like, oh yeah, I'm a totally radically candid guy, but haven't read the book, right? Either don't apply it, right? And
Right.
like, um, I think it just becomes so popular that if you asked any boss, like, are you a radically candid boss? Especially in Silicon Valley, people are like, oh yeah, I'm a radically candid boss. But like, are they actually doing the things in this book? And so you can wind up like me, where you're like, this book sucks because I've had radically candid bosses, but they were all bad at their jobs. But the answer is they weren't really radically candid. And I hate to be like, true radical candor has never been tried,
Right.
right? Um,
Right.
but I do think if you kind of just pick up this book with no misconception, just say like, oh, interesting book. Let me read it and let me see if there's anything in here for me to apply to my management style. I think you'll find a lot. And you can't think of it as like, let me put all of Silicon Valley management on a trial and see if this book is what all it's cracked up to be. Because I think you'll wind up like me and be kind of frustrated with the book until you realize that you're not actually mad at the book. You're mad at some of the managers you've had.
Yeah.
Well, that wraps up Radical Candor this week. We're very excited. We have a great backlog coming up of books. We felt like we've done a couple kind of like career and culture focused books. And so we've been feeling like, you know what? It's really time to dive into some hard technical topics for a while. So I'm excited about what we've got. We've got the next 2 weeks are going to be mastering open telemetry and observability. Very, very excited for this one personally. I've been really, really interested in this at work and actually have done a lot of work in we're using Java or GraphQL with Java Spring. And I finally just kind of got everything instrumented so that we're getting automated metrics for our GraphQL
It's
requests.
life changing. Yeah.
Yes,
This
it's
stuff.
been huge.
Yeah.
Um, so that's been really, really cool. After that, we're doing Learn React with TypeScript. We're hoping that this book isn't so much like I'm really interested in how React works underneath the hood. And so I'm hoping this isn't so much like here's how to build a web app, but more like, okay, what's the actual science behind React? Which we're really excited about. Nathan, this is one you recommended. You said this author has been very popular on LinkedIn. Beyond Vibe Coding. What is this?
Yeah, this one is the guy's like on the Chrome, the Google Chrome team, but
Oh, cool.
he's also doing a bunch of AI stuff. Um, I saw a talk of his where he basically was like, "Hey, we shouldn't call it prompt engineering. We should call it context engineering." It is
Interesting.
very well reasoned, and it was like kind of talking about the inner workings of how LLMs function and everything else. And this was the book that he kind of wrote along with this. And so I think a lot of it is like, how do you get into architecturally how LLMs work so that you can actually use these tools better? And so I don't know. It seemed very well reasoned. It's also got like tremendous amounts of praise, and I thought potentially, obviously, we don't ever promise, but like he'd be a cool guest. He's just a good speaker. But also, the book looks really. I want to I've been using Claude Code and some other tools a lot more recently,
Right.
and this looked like a good deep dive.
Yeah, I'm excited about this. And then, listeners, you're in for a treat. We promised this one. Um, Now, I am looking at the schedule. This is slated for November 17th. We do try to take December off and try to have like, some bonus episodes. So this might get pushed into the new year, but you're in for a treat. Designing data intensive applications. It is on the list. We think by the time we read it, the second edition will be done. Although the second edition is out and you can read kind of like the preview version of it. And so that's what we'll read if we get to it. So whether this happens around November or I think more likely January,
Right.
we'll see. But we're going to do it. We're going to do designing data intensive applications. We're going to devote as much time as we need to it. And this is by far the most requested book from our listeners. So you're in for a treat. Very, very excited to be tackling this one. Well, that's a sneak peek of what's coming up on Book Overflow. Thanks for listening, everyone. We appreciate, like we said, it's great having listeners, and we appreciate anytime you interact with us when you email or comment. And you can do that. You can leave a comment on whatever platform you're on if it allows commenting. And you can email us at contact@bookoverflow.io. You can find us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. I'm on Twitter at Carter Morgan. And Nathan's newsletter, Functionally Imperative, is at functionallyimperative.com. It's been great reading Radical Candor, and we hope to see you around.